Like I said on the Discord, I'll keep the call today a little quick. I don't have the most amount of time. Just want to discuss, two things. One, we can quickly go over today's chart, and two, did want to build on a couple spots we saw yesterday that we talked about. I know Dan posted a daily chart review. I think for the most part, most of it coincided with what we talked about yesterday, but some of it was a little different. So I just kind of wanted to point some of that out. Um, so why don't we get started with today's chart? Was there anything from today that anyone wanted to either take a look at or discuss? Um, Overall, not the most amount. The only trade I really had marked was this triple test here at the bottom here. Um, I think the big kind of thing to discuss here is, we've talked a lot about this kind of post-trend triple test, right? For those that have been on the call, we've talked about, the two main rules that, we're kind of looking at as far as these high percentage trades that Dan is taking is one is the kind of development of clean legs, right, and clean moves into these moves. And if not, having a really solid foundation of a support or resistance, right? And I think Dan had also mentioned, and one thing that we had talked about, and I think Dan mentioned Discord as well, is this trade is kind of coming back into this overall range, right? Which I think in yesterday's call or the day before we had talked about, oftentimes a strong support or resistance is often coincided with a lack of other larger market structure items kind of playing out, right? So I think in this case, the risk comes from, versus other ones where we've had to move to a triple test. This one is extra risky just because we're kind of coming back into this sort of ranging area. So as much as we look at this, right, as an isolated move, we still have this to worry about. Whereas a lot of the other examples we've looked at has been this move coming after other moves have already played out, right? This, as much as this is its own isolated section in here, right? There is also this larger range that is, occurring. And a lot of the examples we've looked at, we look at examples like this where after the trend and the break occurs or after the range is played out, then we look at a move like that. Does anyone else have any comments or anything, questions or anything on this particular trade right here? Okay. Um, did anyone take really anything much from today? Um, there wasn't really a ton. I mean, it was just kind of this range sideways to this kind of move up, break to a kind of spiking channel. Um, Not really a ton. We're at all-time highs or near all-time highs, so it's kind of these kind of days get a little weird because there's obviously other factors at play. Yeah, was there anything else from today anyone want to talk about?
I didn't really see much today. There was um, a second entry long, but I only marked it. I didn't take it. I'm not too sure what time it was though.
Was it earlier or later in the day? I think if it's
No,
later,
it's a bit later.
I would assume we're talking about this one.
Yeah, that's the one.
Yeah. I originally had this one marked and more kind of thought about it. I didn't really love it. I think the argument here for this one is if you do something like that, right? Um, I think we talked about yesterday, right? There was that one second entry, and we had compared it to the one from 2 days ago that everyone got tripped up on. And we said, kind of the main difference was this development of a triple test here. I think this is tradable. I think if someone took it, um, that's, you know, I'll put it this way. In, it's like you've been on a bunch of these calls, we can kind of see the congestion start to develop here, right? And I think what gives this trade some validity is this addition of this. It's such a small nuance here, but this small tick right here gives us that triple test. And I think, if anything, that's what allows us to take that trade. Otherwise, from a strict Dan perspective, I think the sideways, a little bit choppiness of that. But like I said, I don't think you said you didn't take it. We just had it marked. Um, this was the only one I was looking at that
Yeah,
was semi close for me as well.
yeah. If it was just a little bit better looking and the signal
Yeah.
bar was better, I would have taken it. But it was the chop and the signal bar that put me off of it. I was like, that's most probably going to take off, but I just can't enter it.
Yeah, and I think what's also important to note here is when we've looked at some of our being able to be a little more strict with some of the entries that we take at, but then also if trades do fit certain criteria, being a little more free on those. I think what's going to happen is, and this is, I think there's some discussion in Discord today about it, is you're going to miss trades that don't necessarily fit that work, right? And I think this is kind of in that similar vein where, if someone was in, like, if you're looking at this and say it's a little choppy, not the best signal bar, right? It does work, and you're gonna have some trades that happen like that you're like, well, this isn't exactly following my criteria, but it works. That's gonna happen though if you want that kind of month over month, week over week, year over year success, consistently. Um, so yeah, I think if anyone took this, no blame to that at all. It is just a little bit aggressive. I think if you were trying to just, it was more important is if you were trying to leverage the triple test, in that sense, I think you could. It's just, I think everyone could see it's a little sideways. Um, all right. Is there anything else on today's chart?
Not for me.
Okay. One thing that I did want to go over though was yesterday's chart. Because I know, Robert, we were talking about this on the call yesterday. Dan went a little bit more into this, and I think the right thing to do in this scenario is to, I think we, and not just Robert, I think a lot of people on the call yesterday, we had talked about this as one that we would potentially skip. Dan took it, and not to say that every trade that Dan takes, we all need to, rethink, but I think it's worth revisiting some of the things he talked about in that video. Because I think we have left off at the conclusion that it's a little bit risky to take, but I think it's worth taking a second look here, right? I think on this one, the main takeaway here is I think from yesterday's discussion, we had talked about how once you have this failed break, right, we kind of stopped using this area of support, right? Now, for those who, I watched Dan's recap video, and for those who watched it as well, I think the big takeaway from there is, if we were to break and then come back in and retest the support, if we were to get one test, right, that's not necessarily enough, right? Even if we were to get a test plus a higher low, that's not necessarily enough, right? But his dialogue on it was, it's not exactly a triple test, but it in principle is a triple test because it comes back inside the range, tests this area 1, 2, 3 times, right? This is very similar to how I've talked about in the Discord and in the past, where triple tests often act in similar ways as failures, right? In the sense where you establish an area, you test it once, and you test it again, and if it doesn't market moves in twos. If it fails to move in twos, then it often reverses out of there. And that's what happens this one. I think he specifically pointed out on this trade that it tried to go lower 3 times. So once is not enough, twice is not enough, but by the 3rd time, that's when it finally reestablished this support back inside the range and was able to exit out of that. Does that make sense to everyone? That was kind of the main key takeaway I wanted to take from that, because we had discussed this yesterday as being not only not a reestablishment of the range, but also just kind of congested heading back into that. Okay. I'll take that as a no. Yeah, I just really want to reiterate that because, the common theme we've looked at is Dan takes 2 types of trades, right? Clean legs going into it or an establishment of support or resistance. And this trade, and as we looked at yesterday, it doesn't cleanly go into it, right? But when you have 1, 2, 3 tests at a previous support zone, then that's how we are able to say, okay, that is enough for a reestablishment of that support. The other one I thought was interesting to take a look at.
Yeah, I think on that one, it's good.
Sorry, I don't know. You may have cut out. I heard you initially.
Oh, yeah, you were breaking up a little bit. I think where it's a little bit trickier is, where Dan will sometimes talk about, I don't know if that's a channel I can trust.
Mm-hmm.
Then, so you might have the support, but if you're not sure of the channel, then you actually did not have the support you thought you did.
Yeah.
And that can be trickier.
Yeah, that's a great point. And, as with all these trades, if you aren't sure of that support area, then, or even in a trend, don't take it. This is just more, I wanted to revisit this one just because we had talked about it yesterday. And I think our conclusion at yesterday's call was on the other side of it. So because, we are trying to, expand our knowledge, I just wanted to revisit it. It is still, if we're looking at the grand scheme of all the trades that we're looking at, I still think it's on the more aggressive side, right? Because even Dan mentioned it's not the best bar. You're hitting right into the EMA, right? But I think he also mentioned that what happens is you're kind of also trapping a bunch of traders who thought we were going to go to the short side here, right, after this break, which I'm not a big trap trader, but yeah, it is tricky. And in the future, if anyone wants to skip one of these, that's no problem. It's just felt like the at least analysis and the, what he was seeing there was worth talking about.
That one I like. I think it's
one?
more, I think there was discussion earlier, I like that one. Like if it's a spike in channel, I think there was some discussion today, is it a spike in channel or is it more of a coincidence?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah.
And I think that's where, people get burned a lot of times thinking, okay, it looks pretty clear that it is a spike in channel. And then all of a sudden the second entry doesn't work, even though you thought you had support or resistance.
Yeah. Yeah, why don't we do this? I'm going to go over this just one other trade that we can go, I know exactly what you're talking about. We can go over that right after this.
Okay.
And just, from yesterday's call, I'd mentioned I took this trade as a short. I had to draw a little tighter, and it's just one of those things where, as traders, we need to get better at, myself included, short-term trend channel lines, right? I had it tighter, but, it's one of those things where if you draw the proportions, I had it initially off this, but if you do draw it wider, I should have noticed that if you draw it wider here and you match the tops, it came right off the top. Should have been probably a little bit more aware of that, but yeah, just wanted to at least revisit that because, I did take this on. I only took it on one contract, but we did talk about it yesterday on the call. So, yeah, let's look at that because I know the example that some people are looking at. Let me do this. And I think, okay, I think some of the discussion was on this area right here. So drawing this up here, right? And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, some folks had it like this, right? And if I have this wrong, please let me know, but I believe this was the area that some folks were talking about as far as are we in a spiking channel, right? I think the other important thing that I had drawn here, just for that.
Even on that one, you've got congestion on that second entry that doesn't work.
Yeah.
So there's more than one reason to skip it.
Yeah, but just as far as calling it a spiking channel versus, calling it whatever, this is a little bit not as important, but I do want to point it out, right? That at least for me, one of the first things I was looking at was initially on a trade, right? When we've talked about this, ad nauseum the past couple of weeks, is that for me, the first thing I saw here was, on a smaller scale, on any scale, when we have a trend, I'm always looking for, what is a second entry, what is rejection, stuff like that. So in a trend, usually we have the trend, we have a break, and two legs to a new high, right? And if it's vice versa for a low. Well, in this case, then, we're looking at prices to potentially reverse out of there, right? So for me, my first initial thought was, okay, we had this move up, we had the break, then we had the two legs to a new high, right? So my initial is just always going to be when I see something like that, I'm going to be a little cautious of things continuing to go higher, right? And I need a kind of mountain of evidence for that. Now, what we talked about, and I know I use that term, coincidence versus, confident, right, in the Discord. I really think it has to do a lot with the not just, and I think it was a little bit misinterpreted because there's a lot of times I think, it's traders are trying to reverse engineer success, right? Saying, okay, I've been burned in the past. The way that I can become successful is say, okay, I'm only going to take second entries off key entry points, right? And I think that's a great approach and a great mentality to have. I think the only thing that I would really kind of caveat is that what starts to happen then is traders will then try to fit too many things into key entry points, if that makes sense, right? Like when Dan talks about waiting for how things set up, what the market is giving you, market structure, right? I think a lot of traders are spending all day on any swing low or swing high, and they're looking to just try and connect three swings. Because then they say, okay, if I can connect three swings, then I can have a trend channel, or then I can have a key entry point, and I can trade off that key entry point, right? And that will lead to some success, but there is a lot of other things happening that you can kind of overlook on the path to that, right? Like in my mind, right, this swing, even though it does quote unquote fit, this is more of just a product of, well, you've had this break and you've had two retests up, right? The EMA is still having some momentum up, so it's still kind of just more following the EMA more than anything. And we're also at a point where we're expecting the EMA to possibly break soon anyways, right? And this is where, more than anything, right, we've talked about what Dan is looking for. It's the clean legs, right? Like we talked about with on Spike's example, with this second entry being a little choppy, right? And then, if you take away some of the context in the EMA, really this is all, super sideways right here, right? To call something a spike in channel, you really want to see a rejection off this lower level, right? And you can kind of see right here, if you're going to draw it like this and you say, okay, there's 3 touches. Well, this first area doesn't really reject, right? Like this, if this spike in channel was in fact super valid, when it came down here, you would have seen a level of rejection, right? Versus, and here's where later in the day, I was like, after all that talk on spike in channels, well, I was like, we may have another spike in channel just because as I draw like this, right? I know Dan had it like that. I had it more coming off like this. I don't know. It's a huge deal. But you see when we come back down to this support level, how strong it leaves off of that, right? So this is an example of, okay, you get a small touch. I would argue that this is really only 2 touches here, but I feel much better about this spiking channel versus this potential one, right? Because look at the strong rejection off the support, right? Versus on this one, after the 2 legs up, it could be one of 3 things. It could be a spiking channel continuation, it can go sideways, or it can reverse. Well, if there's 3 options, I'm looking for evidence of all 3 options, right? And I think being early on a spiking channel is oftentimes like super dangerous. But there are things you can look for. Are the legs moving cleanly, right? Are you getting strong rejection? Is it just continually just chopping up, right? These are all factors to consider. Does anyone have any comments about that particular concept or anything on that, or especially this area of the chart from today? I would encourage everyone to kind of go back and look at charts and as you're studying, and if you're watching videos of Dan or Mac, pay attention to any time they use the word chop, right? Because for me, this is kind of everything where it's like we had the 2 legs up and then we're kind of chopping down, right? Like for this area, like we're kind of just chopping down versus having, clean legs going into certain areas. So when it comes to spiking channels, you're really looking for more than just connecting bottoms, more than just connecting tops. You're looking for prices to show that, okay, we are definitively not going to reverse out of here. Was there anything else that anyone want to talk about on that, or even from today's, or just in general?
I did see one that we do look at. We looked at it the other day where we would prefer it to be a triple test. I think it was the same time you took your triple test higher, where we broke out of the range, came down, and then we have 2 legs to new low. I think on the second leg, if it was a bit better and it was a triple test, I would have wanted to short that.
Sorry, was it from what day? Today or a different day?
Yeah, from today.
Was it this one
Yeah.
over here?
So if that had become a triple test with the way the EMA is and the legs, I would have been happy to have short that one.
Yeah.
But we didn't have the triple test, so it wasn't something I was ever going to take because of what we've been studying and stuff over it.
Yeah, great example. And this is a great example of one that does work. I think it's super risky. I think if we got the triple test out of here, yeah, I think even Dan had mentioned, once it starts going so sideways, as much as it does kind of look like a lower high second entry, this is more range principle than trend principle, right? So I think Dan had mentioned, right, this as an aggressive one. Yes, Mike, kind of exactly what we're talking about. If this had developed some type of triple test from over here, or, I think that's a very takeable trade. It's just, I think in this scenario it worked, but, in the future we could get burned off that one.
Yeah, I thought I'd bring it up because that's what happened with a lot of people. Was it 2 days ago? And we went through it. So if anyone sees this, that's another one of those.
Yeah, let me bring that up just for reference. I have it up real quick. Not. Yeah. And for reference. Talking about this one, right over here, right? Kind of a similar setup, right? Where it's just, this is an example of one that doesn't necessarily work. Which, I mean, I guess if you're going for the 4-6, I think it worked, but yeah, similar. And this is how, if you want to stay on that like 90-95% trajectory, this is the kind of things you look at. So yeah, great example. Well, all right, like I said, I got to keep this one a little short. If no one else has anything else, then we'll mention, have everyone have a good weekend. Happy Friday. And we'll be right back at it